Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Pepe Jijon TyOxidator wash processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Thankfully Coffee, based out of Auburn, Alabama. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. Thankfully Coffee did reach out to us asking if we were interested in reviewing this coffee, knowing how much we've enjoyed it from other coffee roasters in the past. So I told them to let us know when they were releasing it so we could purchase it. I'm looking forward to discussing their take on it, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a cooler than normal recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee is interesting, as it turned out a fair bit lighter than I had expected going into it. To say that it was actually notably lighter than the Leuchtfeuer version of this coffee that we had reviewed in the past, and it actually reminded me of some of Say's older coffees, which is to say that this is a pretty light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and it was notably different from a lot of other previous versions of this coffee that we've tried in the past. It came out a little bit more delicate and tame relative to some of its contemporaries. Felt extremely light, as there was a little bit more lemon candied sweetness and even a slight grainy quality, but for the most part it offered plenty of brightness, and it was mostly in line with overall expectations I had had for it going into it. We continue on to day 18, ran through the Chemex, and the cup continues to remain very light and delicate, as the citrus remains the most notable component, though there is a slight bit of herbality that's also been present from other versions of this coffee that we've had in the past. Brightness remains ever present, but for the most part, a better day. So we continue on to day 22. Opted for the April brewer, and more of the same, as it continues to remain very light with a continued focus on the citric aspects of the cup. A lingering, long-lasting finish that opens up once it does cool down, but a slight bit of the classic Pepe Jijon brown candied sweetness, with the secondary sweetness and brightness being reminiscent of a lemon candied aspect. So this was the first time I had gotten a glimpse of what this coffee could potentially offer, and it was a little bit more in line with a lot of the previous Pepe Jijon coffees, but this has also been in line with previous experiences, as it's usually the first couple of days that are kind of throwaway days. It takes a little bit to get this coffee right. And on day 25, we lowered the temperatures and went with the V60, and this yielded much improved results. That's also been a consistent theme with these coffees in the past, as it just radiates sweetness from start to finish. Very reminiscent of other versions of this coffee, though this one felt actually, interestingly, a little bit more straightforward than those, as it offered a higher level of sugary brown candied aspects with a background citrus and brightness, but overall it was just a very strong sweet intensity, which I was very much enjoying. We continue on to day 29. Same adjustments through the Chemex, and interestingly for me, it was not quite as sweet and well-defined through this brew method, which has been different from a lot of my experiences with this coffee in the past, as oftentimes I've enjoyed it a little bit more through the Chemex, but this didn't necessarily yield a lot of those similar results, as it accentuated a lot of the citric, bright, and herbal aspects within the cup. There is a little bit of sweetness that's still present, though it does open up once it cools down, this time a little bit more in a candied lemon sense, so a little different from what I'm looking for. But we continue on to day 32, back through the V60 with the same recipe from earlier, and the cup continues to remain intensely sweet, with a focus on the Mejorado brown candy-like sweetness, complemented by citrus, brightness, and just an overall sugariness. Overall, great day, really enjoying the way that this coffee is going. Day 35, same recipe, and I've reached something that I don't often reach with these Pepe Jijon coffees, and that is consistency, as the bright citrus continues to remain one of the more dominant attributes to the cup, but for the most part that brown candied sweetness continues to come through on the cool down, in the finish, in a very sweet, strong, and pronounced manner. It does seem to continue to shine through in that finish, and I actually noted that the caramel was reminiscent of what I described as a Milky Way. So that was interesting, and I'm kind of having fun with this coffee. And on day 39, we continue to run with the same recipe, and it continues to offer tremendous sweetness, especially on the cool down. Many of the listed notes are present once again, bright fruits, citrus. This time I would say even a little bit more of this white peach aspect, as the white peach tends to have that sugary component to it, and given that this coffee was just so sugary to begin with, that also seems to complement the Mejorado brown candy-like attributes to it. So for the most part, a super sweet coffee, and that will take us into the tasting wheel. So let's go ahead and pull that up right now so you can't see what we're getting. And we have 2 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. And to nobody's surprise, the sweetness is at a level 5. And one thing I do have to say about the sweetness of this coffee, it is actually possibly the sweetest of the Pepe Jijon coffees that we've had from any of the coffee roasters, and that does include the original Manhattan version of this coffee. It's very, very close. I would have to go back and try them side by side, though this one right here at its best did seem to offer that tremendous level 6 level of sweetness. So this was an extremely sweet coffee from start to finish, and that was a huge selling point to me on it. Citrus fruit, level 5. So that's kind of interesting because they do have a lot of citric notes listed on here, and I think I kind of compiled those all together, most specifically that lemon. And I always say that when it comes to the brightness, the apple acidity, then the only place to kind of put it in terms of the fruit aspects is on the citrus fruit side of things. So that's why it's as high as it is. Though I do have to say, given just how candied forward in terms of that lemon aspect this coffee is, it would have reached that level 5 even if it didn't offer that in multiple different directions. So this one right here, a very citric forward cup. I have no issue with that given that it was a very sweet citrus to begin with and was consistent throughout. Then we have a bunch of level 4s, so we'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4, also been a consistent theme with these Pepe Jijon coffees. None have scored any higher or any lower. This is just kind of in line with the expectations. As they're not necessarily perfect coffees, I feel like if that reached a level 5 in terms of the clarity, then these coffees are basically untouchable from that point going forward. But level 4 offered great clarity, as one might expect. Finish, level 4. So maybe that's one of the more interesting parts about these Pepe Jijon coffees is that they have a great and long-lasting finish, but not to the extent where it's too long-lasting, too overbearing in any regard. Even then, it is on the higher side of the level 4 as it did have a notably long-lasting finish. Acidity, level 4. Another interesting part of this tasting wheel, as not all of these Pepe Jijon coffees in the past score as high as that level 4, and I feel like that's partially attributed to the roast profile of this one. As I kind of mentioned, it's interestingly and notably lighter than I might have expected. So there's a fair bit of brightness to this cup, which works for me. Have no issues with that. Then you on to florality, level 4. So I didn't mention it too much. I did ever so often briefly the herbal aspect of it, but it did offer some of those Pepe Jijon characteristics, most specifically that hibiscus-like component to it, which has been a consistent theme ever since the first time I tried this coffee. And it's not necessarily my favorite part of this coffee because it does offer so many other tremendous things, and that just kind of gives it maybe a little bit more depth. So rather than being to one note and a lot of the characteristics I've mentioned, it does offer that too, though it's maybe not quite as pronounced enough though to justify that level 4. Caramel, level 4. Yeah, that's of course going to be that brown candy sweetness that I reference when it comes to these típica Mejorado coffees, this one specifically. So there was an abundance of that, and it was felt right from the start, and it was one of the most notable and defining factors of this coffee. I would say, if anything, it's the part that I will always continue to remember from these coffees, as it's the one that leaves the best impression overall. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the berry fruit. Level 3, that has also been a little bit of a consistent theme with some of these Pepe Jijon coffees, as both that and the stone fruit, they seem to offer a little bit of a presence within the cup, though maybe not quite as pronounced as a lot of the other characteristics. That stone fruit, as I had mentioned, not something that we've seen too much in the past, though the Leuchtfeuer version of this coffee did offer a white peach attribute. That's why I could also see a sugary component to this one as well. Bitterness, level 3. That is going to be attributed to the very high citric mark that is present within this one, as it did offer a little bit of a bitter citric component to it, and that's why that did score as high as it did. I feel like I really wanted to make a note of that, so it's probably on the lower side of the level 3, as it's not necessarily as pronounced as intense as it might show on this tasting wheel. But the last thing worth discussing is the body at a level 2, and that's been kind of interesting when it comes to these típica Mejorado coffees, as oftentimes some of the things that people can sacrifice are going to be the acidity and the body, and in this case it did seem to have maybe a little less body than some other coffees, but it's not an issue for me. As I mentioned, those are two things that aren't necessarily my biggest priorities, and that's why when we're really going intense on the sweetness, then it works for me. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think that it's actually a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Once again, Pepe Jijon, this specific one, does continue to impress me no matter who's roasting it, as I haven't had a version of this coffee that I've ever been disappointed by, and that continues to be the theme. Though I do want to give them some credit because this one is a little unique, it's a little different, and that's what I'm noticing from every single one that we are reviewing, is that they do offer something a little different. So when it comes to the hydrangea version of it, there was a little bit more savoriness to it. When it comes to the Leuchtfeuer version of it, there was a little bit more of that sugary candied sweetness, as they mentioned, that cotton candy and white peach. And of course we have the original Manhattan version, which was something that was really impressive. This one skewed a little bit more in the citric direction, which was very unique in its own regard. So that one set it apart from the other ones, at least in terms of the overall experience, as it did offer a fair bit of depth, and it offered a lot of the things that I continue to enjoy from these coffees, most specifically that very high level of sweetness and that very high level of brown candied aspect to it. So I really enjoyed this coffee. That won't come as a surprise to anybody. It has the unfortunate distinction of being in the Ecuador category for our top 10 coffees of the year list. So I would be really surprised if it made it, though it'll definitely make the honorable mentions category because these coffees just continue to impress me each and every time that I do have them. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: if you've loved Pepe Jijon's coffees in the past, but you're looking for something that might offer just a slight bit more citric components to it, maybe a little bit more brightness, this is the perfect direction I can point you towards when it comes to any of these coffees, as this one offered those things in very notable abundance, as right from the start I couldn't help but feel that it just went in a little bit different direction, that citric direction, though at the end of the day it continued to offer what made Pepe Jijon's coffee extremely special to begin with. So massive credits to Pepe once again. He knows how much I love his coffee, and massive credit to his coffee roaster, as I do think they did a nice enough job to set themselves apart from a lot of the other places that have roasted the same coffee. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Pepe Jijon TyOxidator wash processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee. Thank you for watching.